This is Stig of the Dump by Clive King, read by Nana. Chapter 3 It Warms You Twice. Christmas was over at Grandmother's house. The old oak beams were still decorated with trails of ivy, and there were still branches of holly stuck in the tops of picture frames. The last turkey bone had been picked, and the last thimble found in the pudding. They'd even got a good way round the Christmas cake. They had been to a circus. Barney lay in bed in the grey morning light. For once he was not in a hurry to jump out of bed. The air in the bedroom felt icy to the end of his nose. Let me see, he thought. Is there anything special to look forward to today? He couldn't think of anything. He was looking at the thick black beam in the wall that grew out of the floor right up to the ceiling. It had been part of a ship before it was part of the house, Grandfather said. It had deep holes cut out of it where other bits of timber had fitted into it. What was that hidden in one of the holes? Barney sat up in bed suddenly. It was the flint! Stig's flint, left there since last time he'd come to stay, and he hadn't even thought about Stig all over Christmas. He got out of bed and looked out of the window. There was a white frost on the grass. A few hopeful birds hung about the table, fluffed up like woolly balls, waiting for some food to be put out for them. He reached up and took out the flint. It was like a lump of ice. I wonder what it's like living in a cave these days, thought Barney. Poor Stig. He must be cold. After breakfast, Barney slipped out of the house and went off to the pit. In the copse, the frozen leaves crunched like cornflakes under his feet. He climbed down into the pit on the far side, where the cliff was the lowest, and it hurt his little fingers to hold on to the icy tree roots. The nettles were all dead in the bottom of the pit, and the old cans had lumps of solid ice in them. There were no signs of life in the shelter, though he noticed the ashes of a small dead fire and faint smelling of wood smoke still hung around. But at the back of the cave was a kind of nest made of bracken and dead grass and newspaper. He thought he heard breathing sounds coming out of it. Stig, Barney called. Nothing happened. I wonder if it's like a dormouse, he thought, and he goes to sleep all winter. He called again. Stig, are you there? There was a rustle in the nest and a mop of black hair poked up out of it. Under it was Stig's face, but it was screwed up in a very strange expression. Is he cross? Wondered Barney anxiously. His eyes still screwed up and his mouth shut. Stig took a deep breath, and then he sneezed. It was a sneeze like a cannon going off, and it made the cave echo. Oh, you gave me a fright, said Barney. Oh, you've got a cold, Stig. No wonder, when you live in this damp place. You need a good fire. He looked round the shelter and the cave. There didn't seem to be any wood to burn. Stig's heavy flint axe was leaning against the wall, and Barney picked it up and saw the edge was crumbling and blunt. You'll have to sharpen this, said Barney. Stig crawled out of his nest, blinking stupidly. He moved as if his joints were rusty, and he did not take the axe as Barney held it out to him. All right, I'll do it then, said Barney. I expect it's quite easy. And he sat down with the axe between his knees and picked up a heavy iron bolt and tried to remember how he'd seen Stig chip the flint. But it was painful holding the cold flint and the cold iron, and his fingers were so clumsy that they would not do what he wanted them to do. Oh, never mind, said Barney. Come on, we've got to go and get some wood. And he stood up with the axe and went out of the shelter. Stig followed, half awake, half frozen, and silent. They climbed up out of the pit and looked around the copse for wood to cut. Barney could see now that someone, probably Stig, had already been chopping and breaking down the dry branches, and he chose a fairly thin thorn tree and set to work on it. The axe swung, the tree shook, the flint bounced off the tough bark, but didn't seem to be getting anywhere, and Stig just squatted miserably on a bank with his arms wrapped around his knees. Here, you have a go, puff Barney. It'll warm you up. Anyhow, oh, goodness me, Anthony, I've got a cough. I'm just having a drink. That's better. My grandfather always says wood warms you twice, once when you cut it and once when you burn it. He handed the axe to Stig, but Stig only looked at it sadly and shook his head. Barney got worried. He really must do something about Stig, and suddenly he had an idea. Wait here, Stig, I won't be long. Barney ran off through the copse, up the field towards the house, and he went to the shed at the back and got his grandfather's big steel axe and long, sharp cross-cut saw. And what else did he need? Yes, a coil of rope. He slung it over his shoulder and made off again down the field to the copse. Here you are, Stig, he called as he came back to Stig, who was still huddled on the bank. The sight of the shining steel axe worked like medicine on Stig. He uncurled himself and picked up the axe by its long handle. He tried its sharp edges with his thumb. He weighed it in his hand and swung it like a golfer testing a new golf club. His black eyes lit up, and he looked around for something to use his new weapon on. Standing amongst the saplings of the copse was a tall ash tree with a trunk at least 2 feet thick. Stig marched up to it, swinging the axe. Oh no, cried Barney, you mustn't, not that one. But there was no stopping Stig. At the first blow, the blade bit deep into the tree. White chips flew as he swung again and again. Barney hopped around him excitedly. Stig, he called, do you think you ought to? Oh, Stig, Stig, isn't it too big? Stig, Stig. I didn't know you were such a chopper. Well done, Stig. Oh, go on, Stig, let me have a go. And soon there was a great wedge cut into the side of the tree, but it was only still about halfway through. Stig stopped for a rest, and they both looked at the tree. It swayed a little in the light breeze. You know what, Stig, said Barney. It's going to fall and smash the fence if we're not careful. I'd better tie a rope to it. He slung the coil of rope round him and pulled himself up by the lower branches of the tree. He'd climbed most of the trees around before, but he'd never climbed up one that was already chopped halfway through. He supposed he should have tied the rope on before they started cutting. As he climbed higher, he could feel something different about the swaying of this tree. It did not have the springy, excited sway of a sound tree. It was only swaying a few inches, but at the end of each sway you had the feeling that it was waiting, not quite sure whether it would sway back again or whether it would just go and fall. He tied the rope to the trunk as high as he dared, threw the rope outwards and watched it uncoil to the ground, and scrambled down again himself. Now, we ought to put it on the other side, said Barney. I've seen Grandfather do this. He picked up the big cross-cut saw. Here, you take the other end, he told Stig. Stig looked at the saw doubtfully. He felt its sharp teeth and grunted approval, but he didn't really understand what they were going to do with it. Look, said Barney, you hold that end and I hold this end. I pull and then you pull. It's easy once you get started. Stig looked a bit blank. They scraped away clumsily at the bark on the tree trunk until at last they sawed The saw teeth cut a straight groove and settled into it. Stig's eyes widened as the sawdust began to fly, and he pumped the handle furiously. "Ouch!" said Barney. "You're pulling too far. You've made me skin my knuckles." "Steady!" cried Barney. "Must we go so fast? I've got a long way to go yet." "Stop!" cried Barney. "Look, Stig, you're pushing as well as pulling. It makes the saw bend, and it makes you tired too." At last they settled down to a steady in, out, snore, 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 snore. The blade sang as it bit deeper into the wood, and the sawdust spurted out each end, and the whole thing seemed to get sticky, and at last, however hard they struggled, they could not move it either way. "Bother!" said Barney. "Now what?" They stood back and looked at the tree. The weight of branches on one side was making the trunk lean that way and closing up the crack the saw had made. "We'll have to pull," said Barney. Stig and he took the end of the rope and heaved. The crest of the tree came slowly towards them, hung still, and swayed back again. They heaved again. This time the tree seemed to have come a little further, hung longer, but still it swung back. With their third pull, as it rocked towards them, then came a cracking sound from the trunk. "It's coming!" cried Barney excitedly. The tree swayed away from them again, but they heaved this time, and this time there was more splintering cracks. "Once more!" shouted Barney. They tugged. The tree rocked slowly, hung at the end of its swing, then instead of rocking back again, lurched further over towards them. From the trunk came a splitting, rending, screeching sound, and Stig and Barney turned and ran. Barney heard an appalling rush behind him, and Barney heard an appalling rush and crash and splintering of branches behind him as the crest hit the ground, and the topmost twigs thrashed the back of his legs as he ran. They turned round to look. Barney's heart was bouncing with excitement. "Phew! We've done it!" he gasped, gaping at the ruin they'd made and the empty hole they'd left in the skyline. What a lot of firewood! Right, I'm going to stop it there and start again in another minute. So that was the first part of chapter 3.